Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Q&A. We are talking about the Missouri Adaptive Ability Scale, also referred to as the MAS assessment. I am Carrie Slimmy. I'm the Assistant Director of Family Supports at St. Louis ARC. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Amanda. If you would like to introduce yourself and tell us your role at DMH.
My name is Amanda Hewlett. A lot of people call me Mandy. If you've heard Mandy, that's okay too. I am the Director of Intake and Assessment for the Division of Developmental Disabilities. I work throughout the entire state with intake and assessment and all the different regional offices that include St. Louis. What I am here today to kind of discuss is the MAS, which stands for the Missouri Adaptive Ability Scale. I know that there were quite a few questions about what the MAS is, who completes it, and then just several other questions. So my goal today is to try to provide you with as much information as possible and answer as many questions as I can. So hopefully everyone leaves here with a better understanding of what this adaptive assessment is, why it's utilized, when it's utilized, and how it affects Medicaid waiver funding. That's kind of the overview of what I'll be doing. So I'm gonna share, and I'm gonna take you to where we can find a lot of this information, because I think that that's going to be a big piece as well. So I will explain what the Missouri Adaptive Ability Scale is, but I want to give you the resource to be able to look this up on your own independently after this webinar as well. So if you go to dmh.mo.gov, that is the Department of Mental Health standard webpage. If you click on developmental disabilities at the top and scroll down to community supports, there's a little star here and it says intake and eligibility. So this is where you're going to find any information about our assessments. Once you click on that, it's going to explain eligibility information. And as you scroll down, you'll see a little section that says the assessment process. If you click on that little arrow, there's information on how to schedule that assessment that's pretty specific to support coordinators. But then there's also this MAS reference guide, which is going to be really good information for parents, individuals, families, guardians, and support coordinators to learn a little bit more. So this is going to be your table of contents. But what's most important right here and what I'm going to go over is kind of the purpose and what the MAS actually is. So the MAS reference guide really is to provide additional information and explain what the MAS is. So that was the whole purpose behind this. If you scroll down, it'll talk about eligibility requirements. This is specific for the division. I'm guessing that most of these people probably have already been found eligible and now are wanting to get funded services. So I'm going to skip through this information. But the MAS history, what is the MAS? Why was it created? Who created it? So this began in 2015. Dr. Clay Stearns, who worked for the Division of Developmental Disabilities for several years in the Department of Mental Health, he made this kind of his mission and his goal to develop an adaptive assessment that meets state, federal, diagnostic criteria and just be standardized and used by the state of Missouri. So he worked with State University and other subject matter experts, and it took several years. They did a lot of statistical analysis, and essentially they developed the MAS. One of the things that they did do, and you may have heard of Neil Harms, he also assisted with the development and creation of the MAS. He's one of my predecessors and was a former intake and assessment director as well. So one of the things that's very important to know about the MAS is that it is not only an adaptive assessment, but it also takes over as our priority of need scoring, or that PON. So basically, whenever you are making a funding request, we determine from this assessment where you fall in line as far as what the priority of need is. So is your need greater or less than somebody else? The other thing that it also does is if you or an individual were receiving residential services, it determines the rate allocation score, or RAS. So essentially, how much money does it cost to provide the level of care that they require? And that's what that score is. Previous adaptive assessments that we used did not determine all of these factors. They only looked at adaptive functioning and determined functional limitations. So this assessment really did 3 assessments job in one. So that's one thing that's very important to remember is this assessment was specifically designed for Missouri and how we provide funding and what those requirements are. So the purpose of the MOS is to measure adaptive functioning in the 6 major life areas. So that's going to be learning, mobility, communication, self-care, self-direction, and independent living or economic self-sufficiency. This is just going to go over what I talked about the priority of need and rate allocation score. Another very important thing to know about the MOS is that this has been credentialed. This has been tested. It's been norm referenced. It is statistically sound and very, very strong assessment. It's very comparative to the Vineland Adaptive Assessment as well as the ABOS. So we do know that this is validity of this is very strong. And that's one of the questions that we often get is, why did we create our own when they're already out there? It's truly because this one assessment takes place of 3 assessments that we would have previously had to do. The other thing that is very important to know, and I'm not going to go over all of this because you guys can definitely look at this and it'll provide you with much more information than I am about the specific what makes our assessment great versus some of the others. But one thing that I also want to mention is prior to the MOS, the Mokabi was used as well as the Vineland. And so one thing that we kind of lost as a state whenever we were using the Mokabi and the Vineland is the ability to control who completes the assessment. So Mokabis were being completed by support coordinators across the state. And although we had pretty specific requirements as far as what an assessor needed to do and complete, a lot of times that would get lost. So somebody may not have gone through full credentialing before they were completing that Mokabi. So the state's kind of taken that back. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to make sure that these assessments were completed by qualified assessors. And so the MOS isn't completed by any private TCMs. It's not completed by any support coordinators across the state. It's completed by a group of less than 30 assessors that work throughout the state. The other thing is that this assessment is exclusively virtual. So that is completely different than what we've done in the past. So completely virtual means that there's no requirement to come into the office, to sit down face-to-face with someone, to have someone come into their home. This can be done over a smartphone, laptop, computer, tablet. We do ask that you have access to a camera in order to complete the assessment because the individual will have to perform a few tasks and answer some questions. And so they need to be visually seen by the assessor. But that also means that you could be completing the assessment with somebody who is not familiar with the area you live in. For example, I'm in the northwest corner of Missouri, and it would be very, very common for me to have an assessment completed by an assessor who actually resides in St. Louis. So that also allowed us to have more flexibility throughout the state to allow some high population areas such as St. Louis to be supported by some lower population areas. So that's one of the cool things about this as well is we're able to do a lot more with fewer staff. The credentialing in order to become an assessor is very extensive. They do quarterly checks to make sure that those assessors are completing the assessment to the degree required. So you're really getting very sound assessors who know what they're doing and can walk you through. And that's something that I think is very, very nice about this assessment as well. So that's kind of my brief overview and quick guide to this. I will make sure that this website gets sent out so you guys can just quickly reference it. And I think it will be able to answer several questions that you may have just about the assessment itself. So
Yeah, Awesome, thank you. We did have a couple questions just come in. So someone
Yeah.
had mentioned, what if you have feedback or personal stories about how this test may not fully capture my loved one's needs? And how often do they look at the MOS to see if it may need updates?
So the MOS is completed every 3 years. However, if there is a significant change in circumstance or the individual's abilities, we can do a MOS review at any time. So if a MOS was completed, let's say 6 months ago, but your loved one took a fall and now they have significant mobility issues and you don't feel like the MOS is representative of their current and future state, that would be a really good time to ask for a MOS review. So those can definitely be done, and they're not a full MOS. This is really where an assessor will meet with the informant and the support coordinator and will ask several questions and will update that MOS as appropriate. Most generally, the individual does not have to participate in that. It's strictly informant and support coordinator only. This assessment, by all accounts, looks at the same things that all the other adaptive assessments out there do. In fact, if you look at some of the questions, they're very, very similar to what you would see with the Vineland or the ABES or the ABOS. So statistically, this is a sound assessment for adaptive functioning, just the same as any of the others.
So another question, are the results of these studies utilized externally at all, like for research studies through universities to further services and research for the IDD population?
No, these we're actually very, very cautious about how and who we share information with. So whenever these assessments are completed, a MOS report is generated. That MOS report is not very thorough, but it's not very thorough because we don't want to inadvertently share any information or do anything that could ruin the construct validity of the assessment. So that MOS report just really provides the basic information that a support coordinator or family needs in order to determine what the results of that assessment actually were. At no point in time do we ever share any of our findings from the assessment. They're not used for any studies, or internal, external, or otherwise. This is truly just to provide the family with the information that they need and to provide us with the information we need about whether or not we're meeting the state and federal regulations for eligibility.
The MOS is administered by specifically trained staff that aren't the case managers, correct?
That is correct, yes.
And then they said, if so, so how did those two staff work together?
So what happens is the support coordinator will make the request for the MOS. So if you saw on that website, there was something that specifically said MOS scheduling. So a support coordinator would be able to go to that link. It actually links up to all of our assessors' calendars where they can pick a date and a time that works best for the individual and the informant, and then they can go ahead and schedule it. We also have assessors that will call and do the scheduling themselves based on reevaluation. So they don't know about new ones, but they know about every 3-year reoccurrences that happen. And so they will call and schedule for the 3-year reevaluations. So you may hear from somebody that you're not really familiar with, and that's just one of our assessors reaching out because that individual was due for a new MOS.
Okay. I do want to get to some of the pre-submitted questions just to make sure we get to those. So are there any trainings from Division of Developmental Disability for support staff to learn more about the MOS?
So when the MOS was originally put into production, I believe almost 3 years ago, if not fully 3 years ago, there were several trainings that were offered to support coordinators and support staff in order for them to get a better understanding of the MOS and how to schedule it. And we've done several lunch and learns since. However, now that everyone's becoming more familiar with this, one of the expectations is that individual TCMs and support coordinators receive that training internally. However, if this is something that we feel is a need, we can definitely look at providing additional lunch and learns and potentially even full trainings if we feel like this is necessary.
So this one's a little bit more specific. I won't no names or anything. So someone said our daughter took the MOS test in April. We can't get through to our case manager to follow. We can't get our case manager to follow through on her end to help get her on the list. I'm assuming she means the waiver wait list. Do you have suggestions?
So one of the things I can recommend is obviously there's a chain of command. So you reach out to the support coordinator. If you can't get a hold of the support coordinator, you reach out to their supervisor, and then it would be the director or of the agency or TCM. If you've done all of those steps, the next step would be to bring it to the regional office level. So I would recommend contacting, I'm assuming the St. Louis regional office, and either asking to speak with either Jenny Thompson or Emily Reinhardt. Those are going to be the directors over there. And then they can guide you to whether or not they feel like this should go to a TCM TAC or which TCM TAC stands for Targeted Case Management Technical Assistance Coordinator, or they can handle that directly. That would be the next step that I would recommend taking in that situation.
Okay. That's usually what we tell our families too, is to start with, if you don't hear from the case manager, then go to the supervisor and just work up that chain of command. Okay, so more questions. How does the MOS assessment align with funding availability for waivered services?
So what that MOS assessment looks at is adaptive functioning limitations. So whenever we do Medicaid funded waivers, we have to look at the Code of Federal Regulations. So the Code of Federal Regulations requires that an individual have minimally 3 functional limitations. So whenever we complete that MOS, it's going to look to see if an individual meets those 3 functional limitation requirements. And so that is the standard that is set by federal regulations, and that's what it looks like.
After the MOS, are caregivers or staff educated about what those results actually mean for supporting that individual?
So that education doesn't typically come from our assessment specialist. That would be something that a support coordinator could provide an explanation. But like I said, those MOS reports are they're pretty basic and they're fairly easy to read. But there's not a ton of information on them. So essentially it would tell you yes or no, do I meet eligibility criteria? And then what areas did I have a functional limitation in? And then there's a write-up below that explains what those areas look like. So support coordinators should be able to explain what that means with families. But if you feel like you need additional information, that support coordinator can always reach out to the assessment team and we can definitely schedule a time to answer any questions.
Another question, is your MOS score the same as PON? If not, how does one impact the other?
So no, they are not the same. So the MOS actually looks at adaptive functioning and adaptive limitations. So we talked about like mobility, learning, those specific areas, but the priority of need is going to look at other things outside of actual abilities. It's going to look at life situations, circumstance. For example, if an individual is currently unhoused or has been arrested, or other situations that may put them at a higher risk than the next person their age with the same set of abilities. So that's what the priority of need is actually going to look at. So they're really measuring separate things.
Is there an ideal timeline for how long this takes from request to administration to results of the MOS?
So I typically tell families to expect from the time that a MOS is requested or to the time that it's actually completed to expect 2 to 3 weeks. So the MOS itself doesn't take very long. It takes about an hour to an hour and a half to complete. And the write-up doesn't take very long because essentially the Excel document just generates the responses after, or generates the scores after they receive the responses. So that in itself takes very, very little time. Usually our assessors have the completed MOS report to support coordinators within 3 business days of the assessment actually being completed. What takes the 2 to 3 weeks is actually finding a date and getting that scheduled and getting it on the calendar. So right now our assessors are usually 2 to 3 weeks out with the assessment, and that's what's really taking the bulk of the time.
Another question, When our son had our MOS last year, I don't recall much in the way of questions that assessed the health of the parent slash caretaker. A number of the questions were hard to select answer A or answer B. That is 90% of the time. It's answer A, but every couple of weeks it would be answer B. So these were difficult to answer and required some thought. The person running the assessment did not provide any hints to give us guidance. So I think they're speaking to some of those questions where it's like some of the time it's like this, and then you know what I'm saying? Like where it's like really hard to know how to select an answer because it just varies on the situation.
Absolutely. And so our assessors are trained not to really lead informants, parents, guardians in one direction or the other, just for the reason that we don't want to inadvertently affect the scoring. However, what I always recommend is what is the majority of the time. So if the answer is the majority of the time, the answer is A, but occasionally it's B, then I would always answer A. And we kind of talk about previously when I did assessments, one of the things that I would let parents know up front, you know. So let's say an individual can tie their shoe 5 days out of the week, but last week they refused to tie their shoe 4 days. I'm really going to be focused on the fact that last week and most recently they're refusing to tie their shoe, but I know that they have the capability of doing it. But we're looking at current state, right? So I would answer, no, they cannot tie their shoe because they're currently refusing to do it. So even though I know that they have that skill and ability, they're not doing this. So we're really looking at current state. And I don't know if our assessors are trained to really push families in that direction, but that's always the advice that I would give, is to truly look at what's happening consistently at this point in time and not what was happening consistently a month ago.
That's helpful. Are there certain steps or requirements that must be done before a MOS can be requested?
So the main thing about requesting a MOS is that we haven't done one in the last 3 years, and that there is a need for funded service. So typically whenever an individual is coming through intake, if they don't have a current adaptive assessment or they haven't previously been found eligible, intake will go ahead and complete that MOS automatically as part of their eligibility determination. So a lot of times individuals are being sent with a current MOS, but there are several situations in which they do not have one. We used a third-party collateral assessment, meaning one that was completed by the school. Maybe the school did a Vineland as part of the IEP process, and so we used that to find the individual eligible. So that would be a time, but really the only requirement is that you haven't had one completed in the last 3 years, and that there's a need for the MOS, whether that be because you're requesting a funded service, or because we're trying to determine that you're eligible.
And then another question is, who gives the applicant's abilities? And I think that they're meaning who is answering the questions. Is it the applicant or the parent? And they said, my son thinks he is much more able in many areas than he actually is.
That's one other very, very nice component of the MOS is that it not only looks at the individual and their specific abilities, but it also it gathers a lot of information from an informant, whether that be a parent, a guardian, but it's somebody outside of that individual, because we do have a lot of individuals that are very, very capable, but maybe their confidence level isn't the same as somebody who knows them very well. So the first part of the assessment is actually where the assessor will ask a series of questions and ask the individual to perform a series of tasks. And then the second part is just a question and answer session strictly with the informant. A lot of times they will go ahead and ask the individual to even potentially leave the room or leave the area because it may be difficult for that informant to answer these questions in front of them. So it does capture both of those.
We just want to thank everyone for joining today's Q&A. Thank you, Mandy, for being here and answering our questions. And we hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Mandy.